Hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Katrina Baker, Medical Assessor in the Pediatric Unit. Over to you, Katrina.
Good morning. Thank you all for joining us for the next in our series of EU exit and post-transition guidance webinars. Next slide, please. So today's aim is to provide information on paediatric requirements for human medicines in the United Kingdom from the 1st of January 2021. This webinar will run for around 45 minutes and we will update you on the current approved paediatric guidance. We will address questions after we've presented on the guidance and have grouped your pre-submitted questions, which will be answered first in this session. We will then address questions submitted today, again in an aggregated way. If you identify additional questions after the webinar, we recommend addressing through your trade association. The webinar is being recorded and a link will be sent to delegates once available. Next slide. Please note, in some cases, to illustrate aspects of the transition guidance, we've used graphics to enhance explanation of the guidance. These will not be included as official enhancements in the guidance. Next slide. So on to the agenda for this morning. I'll start with an introduction about the transition period and then move on to cover the two main aspects of UK paediatric requirements for human medicines from the 1st of January. Please note that this MHRA series of webinars only covers human medicines and we are not covering food standards or veterinary medicines. First, I'll discuss paediatric investigation plans and associated procedures, including annual reports and compliance checks. Next, I'll explain the requirements relating to completion of paediatric studies. Then finally, I'll briefly cover MHRA Submissions, which is the system for submitting paediatric applications from January. So I'd like to start by briefly explaining the transition period. When the UK left the EU on the 31st of January 2020, the withdrawal agreement created a transition period until the end of 2020 that provided certainty to businesses while the UK and EU negotiated its future trading relationship. From the 1st of January 2021, the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, MHRA, will be the UK's standalone medicines and medical devices regulator. As such, the MHRA has published detailed guidance on how medicines and medical devices will be regulated at the end of the transition period, in both a negotiated and non-negotiated outcome with the EU. Great Britain, which is England, Wales and Scotland, will operate to an initial legal framework that incorporates EU legislation into UK law. However, the UK regulator will be able to take sovereign regulatory decisions to help evolve the UK legal regime to meet future UK needs, and to take regulatory decisions that will also apply directly in Northern Ireland, as long as those decisions do not conflict with EU decisions while the Northern Ireland Protocol applies. Underpinning all these actions is the UK government's commitment to ensure that there will be no impediment across the UK to securing access of vital medicines, including vaccines, following the end of the transition period. So I'm now going to talk about paediatric investigation plans, also known as PIPs. The UK will have a system of PIPs, waivers, modifications, compliance checks, and annual reports. And over the next few minutes, I'm going to explain these procedures. Our general approach is to aim to simplify the PIP submission process by offering an expedited assessment where possible. Next slide. So the legal requirements for UK PIPs are set out in the Human Medicines Regulation 2012 as amended, which I'll refer to from now on as AHMRs. And in particular, regulations 50A to D are particularly relevant to PIPs. Any marketing authorization application to the MHRA for which PIP provisions apply should contain one of the following: either the results of all studies of an agreed PIP, a decision granting a deferral, but note that this will be subject to a compliance check, a decision granting a product-specific waiver, or a class waiver. And the EMA decision number granting the class waiver should be quoted in the marketing authorization application, or alternatively, you can request confirmation from the MHRA whether a class waiver will be accepted. Next slide, please. So, under transitional provisions, EU PIPs, waivers and modifications agreed by the EMA before the 1st of January 2021 will be adopted as UK PIPs. These will be referred to as adopted UK PIPs. You are not required to resubmit these to the MHRA. In cases where a valid request for an EU PIP modification or waiver has been made to the EMA, but no decision has been given before the 1st of January 2021, the EU PIP will be adopted as a UK PIP if the EMA Paediatric Committee, PDCO, has given a positive opinion with which the UK has concurred. These will not require resubmission to the MHRA either. In the case where a valid request for an EU PIP or modification or waiver has been made to the EMA, but PDCO has not yet given an opinion, or where the UK disagreed with the PDCO's opinion, these will require submission to the MHRA. So to reiterate, adopted UK PIPs are those EU PIPs which have been adopted under transitional provisions. New successful PIP submissions to the MHRA will be referred to as agreed UK PIPs. Next slide. So this flowchart is from our guidance document, and it explains the assessment pathway for PIPs submitted to the UK from the 1st of January. Applicants should provide information on whether there is an agreed EU PIP, if there's an ongoing EU PIP assessment, and the point in the PDCO assessment cycle, for example, day 30, day 60, clock stop, day 90, or day 120. Applicants should also highlight if there is any scientific divergence between the submitted UK PIP and EU PIP. This information will be used to determine the MHRA assessment process, which is described in sections 1.3 and 1.4 of the process for UK PIPs guidance. If there is no EU PIP, a full MHRA assessment is required. If the application is for a paediatric use marketing authorization, then a focused MHRA assessment is required. If there is an agreed EU PIP or ongoing PDCO assessment of an EU PIP, then we will consider whether a full or focused MHRA assessment is required. In principle, we will aim to accept a positive PDCO opinion. However, we will take into account unmet UK paediatric needs, whether this is a paediatric-only development, particularly for innovative products, the incidence of the disease in the UK population, the relevance of the scientific arguments by EMA PDCO summary reports to the UK paediatric population, any additional safety or efficacy concerns for the UK population, the nature and number of licensed products already available for the intended paediatric indication in the UK, the feasibility of performing the proposed paediatric studies in the UK, and whether the PIP is to support a UK paediatric use marketing authorization. Areas of unmet need in the UK paediatric population include those defined by UK health bodies as high priority public health concerns, product development and conditions under the UK Strategy for Rare Diseases, products intended to be authorised as orphan medicines, and product development in conditions identified as critically important in the EU Paediatric Regulation 10-year report. Based on your feedback, we've realised that there's a need to update this flowchart with a more detailed explanation about EU PIPs that at January 2021 are ongoing, have not reached opinion and decision, but are in the advanced stages of assessment. Those EU PIPs which reach a positive opinion or have a decision will be adopted. For those with an ongoing EU PIP assessment, we are aiming to issue further advice shortly, taking into account the stage of assessment at PDCO. We will aim to accept ongoing EU PIPs, but will take decisions based on national needs. Next slide. So it's important to note that applicants should include information in any UK PIP submissions of any relevant issues specific to the UK, particularly with respect to any areas of unmet therapeutic need that this product intends to cover in the UK. And applicants might consider priority areas in UK paediatrics, underrepresented groups such as neonates, oncology indications, and areas where there's a strong UK scientific background or where clinical practice differs to the EU. Regarding an applicant's paediatric study plan agreed by the US Food and Drug Administration, applicants should provide the agreed PSP as part of their UK PIP submission. We aim to take a global approach to encourage paediatric developments and avoid unnecessary duplications of efforts where acceptable. A case-by-case discussion should always be considered for any UK paediatric submissions that do not fall into any of the pre-specified criteria in our guidance. Next slide, please. Where it's not planned that a study or other measure in the PIP will be initiated or completed before the submission of the corresponding marketing authorization application in adults, a deferral may be requested for either the initiation or completion of the study or both. Requests for deferral should be justified on scientific and technical grounds or on grounds related to public health, and a deferral may be granted where it's appropriate to conduct studies in adults prior to initiating studies in the paediatric population. It's important to note that a clinical study report is required for the MHRA to perform the compliance check, so this should be taken into account in the final timelines of the submission. Next slide. So annual reports. The MHRA will have a requirement for annual reports for agreed UK PIPs. Marketing authorization holders with an agreed UK PIP who have received a deferral must submit annual reports to the MHRA. An annual report should be submitted for each PIP, even if there are several PIPs for the same medicine. And the first annual report should be submitted within a period of 12 months, beginning with the date on which the licensing authority granted the deferral. Submissions for annual reports can be made through MHRA Submissions. Next slide. The EMA maintains a list of class waivers which will be adopted by the UK from the 1st of January 2021. The MHRA will maintain the current EU class waiver list as applicable to the UK, although this might be subject to future updates. Until further notice, the relevant EMA decision on class waivers for the medicinal product and condition should be quoted with marketing authorization applications in the UK. Where there is no class waiver decision listed, we will aim to accept a positive EMA opinion, or we can undertake an MHRA class waiver assessment. If you have received a negative opinion on the applicability of an EMA class waiver from PDCO, you must notify us of this, and you will be required to either submit a full product-specific waiver application in the UK or a UK PIP. Next slide, please. So moving on to modifications, again, a flowchart from our guidance. As per EU PIPs, modifications of EU PIPs which have been agreed before the 1st of January 2021 will be adopted as UK modifications. These do not need to be submitted to the MHRA. However, you should carefully consider your timings for marketing authorization applications. During validation of marketing applications, compliance with an agreed or adopted UK PIP will be checked. So if there has been a subsequent divergence from the PIP details held by the MHRA compared to the EU, a modification may be required before submitting a compliance check and marketing authorization application. This flow diagram shows how we will consider modifications. Key aspects to consider are whether there is already an agreed EU PIP modification, whether there's ongoing assessment of the modification, whether the modification is for an agreed or adopted UK PIP, and whether there is scientific divergence between the currently agreed EU and UK PIP. If there's no agreed EMA modification or there's divergence between the UK and EU, then a UK assessment will be required, and this will be a full assessment if there is no agreed EU modification. If there is an agreed or adopted PIP, the assessment pathway is determined by whether there is an EU PIP modification opinion. If there isn't, then a full or focus assessment will be undertaken as per section 1.3 of the guidance. Incidentally, thank you to the participant who spotted an error on this diagram. So on the right-hand side, it asks if assessment criteria in section A3 have been met, and this should read section 1.3. If there is a positive opinion on an EU modification, we will aim in principle to accept this where the initial UK PIP was agreed on the basis of an EU PIP. For ongoing EU modification assessments, we will also aim in principle to accept a positive opinion. Otherwise, we will consider the criteria in section 1.3 to determine whether a focused assessment is required. If there's a negative PDCO opinion, you may either continue with the MHRA assessment and discuss amendments to the proposals before the final MHRA opinion, or you can withdraw and submit a new modification. Next slide. So briefly to run through compliance checks, for adopted EU PIPs, we will aim to also adopt positive PDCO compliance checks unless there have been subsequent modifications which led to divergence between the EU and UK. Please note that applicants should pay particular attention to the agreed timelines of measures which need to be completed after the PDCO compliance check to ensure compliance on the date of UK marketing authorization application submission. PDCO compliance check documents should be submitted to us ahead of or at the same time as marketing authorization. For adopted PIPs, MHRA submissions should recognise and accept the EMA number. Next slide. For agreed UK PIPs, a UK assessment is required for full or interim compliance check if there is either scientific divergence between the agreed UK and EU PIP, or if there is no PDCO compliance check. However, we will aim to adopt the PDCO compliance check outcome if this is positive and the EU and UK PIPs are equivalent. We will issue a statement of compliance when all the agreed PIP measures have been successfully completed and the marketing authorization is granted. Next slide. Northern Ireland will continue to be part of the EU system for paediatric medicines development, including agreement of EU paediatric investigation plans or waivers. We will take decisions on PIP and waiver opinions, modifications and compliance statements to support paediatric market authorization decisions while acknowledging that EU PIPs remain applicable for Northern Ireland. Paediatric obligations in line with the unfettered access GB marketing applications will be met by the agreed EU PIP or waiver as required. Next slide. So now we move on to the other section, which is paediatric requirements for marketing authorization holders. Next slide. So under Regulation 78A of the HMRs, holders of UK marketing authorization who sponsor a study involving the paediatric population, in respect to the medicinal product to which the authorization relates must submit to the MHRA the results of the study within 6 months, beginning with the day on which the trial ended. And this applies irrespective of whether or not the studies are conducted in accordance with an agreed PIP, or whether the MAH intends to apply for a marketing authorization for a paediatric indication. These provisions replace Article 46 of the EU Paediatric Regulation. We will also consider the outcome of any CMDH paediatric work sharing procedures reviewed under Article 45. And if required, the MHRA will request updates to the product information. Next slide, please. So under transitional provisions, the process for submission is outlined in our guidance, but briefly, MAHs should submit a cover letter within 6 months of completion of the concerned paediatric studies to the MHRA in eCTD format via email. The MAH should indicate in the cover letter whether the studies are linked to other paediatric studies and if the studies relate to a UK PIP. We will then initiate an initial appraisal and inform the MAH whether assessment of the data is required, in which case a variation is requested within 60 days. Under our transitional provisions, if the results of a paediatric study have been submitted to the EMA or CMDH under Article 46 of the regulation prior to the 1st of January, then the process will remain within the EU assessment framework, and no UK equivalent procedure will be initiated unless the MAH indicates that an urgent safety update is required. Next slide, please. So finally, moving on to MHRA submissions, this will be our portal for submitting paediatric applications and variations from January. Next slide. From January, submissions relating to human medicines should be submitted via the MHRA Submissions homepage. So this includes marketing authorizations, variations, UK PIPs, waivers, modifications, deferrals, annual reports and compliance checks. The links on these slides provide information on how to register to make submissions. You can register now for MHRA submissions and can find technical Q&A information and videos online. Next slide. We will be open for UK PIP submissions from the 1st of January 2021. Once you've registered and logged on, select the PIP tile on the homepage, and 5 web forms are available for either PIP, waiver, modification, compliance check, or annual report. Select the relevant one, upload supporting documents, press submit, and you should receive a confirmatory email which includes your new MHRA PIP number. We will then contact you to confirm validity of the submission and confirm timelines. Next slide, please. So these are the links to our paediatric guidance pages. We'll be updating these shortly with more information about in-flight PIPs and considering updates based on any questions received during these series of webinars. So with that, thank you for joining us today and enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.